Hello, everyone. So today we have Ken Novella on the show with us. So this is the inaugural Hazardous Area Safety podcast. We couldn't really think of a better name for it or more hip name, so we just went with boring because sometimes boring works. So, Ken, welcome to the show.
Speaking of boring, thank you. Nice to catch up with you again, Travis.
No worries. So, let's start telling people, or give us a bit of a background about who you are, what you do, how you got into the industry.
Who I am. So, currently I'm the chair of the Australian Standards Committee EL025, and I'm also the chair of the Centre for Static Electricity and Lightning Protection. I hold a number of roles in terms of membership to numerous other standards, in particular lightning protection, but also some of the hazardous area standards, and primarily in an advisory role. How I got into the industry, well, that's a long story, but that's
That's all.
misguided youth, all manner of different things.
I fell into it. I fell into sales.
Yeah. Look, I started with a fairly healthy interest in the electrical world, if you like, and I just began to specialise, and over a period of time, moved into to management circles, and then realised that really wasn't my area. I wanted to concentrate on investigations, the forensic side of the electrical world, if you like, and began to specialise in static electricity, which was a little bit of a absolute 180. Sorry, everything you know about the electrical world, you had to suspend because the static electrical world is very, very different, and how you manage that particular hazard and the associated risks are also very, very different. And then I went into educational training programs, and as I mentioned before, obviously the advocacy area where we moved into voluntarily assisting standards, because in the static world we had a standard that was last reviewed in 1995. It was horribly out of date, and we actually had, at the time that both Jason McGee and myself proposed an update, the committee was actually defunct, so we had to reinstate the committee with the assistance of Standards Australia. And then the arduous task of physically going through the standard itself, reviewing it, redrafting, going through the drafting process, and then obviously in 2023 being able to see all of the fruits of the committee's labour in terms of the standard being updated and obviously published.
So, do you think that kind of hesitation or the actual committee being defunct were the contributing factors that came to it? Because, like, obviously, when we talk about static control, if you talk to any electronics engineer, they have a really good grasp and handle on it. They understand like what static would do with their board interactions when they're working on the interfaces, when they're working in a laboratory environment. But if you transition that into like a process and an electrical perspective, there isn't a correlation between the two. There's a vast gap of knowledge that isn't bridged between the two industry types. And do you think that is a cause that, people were just like, oh, well, the electronic engineers know about it. It doesn't really apply to us. Where do you think that came from?
Well, I think there's two parts. One of the things is gap in knowledge, and the knowledge holders at the time. So we're talking 2013 to 15 at this point when I was involved in the proposal for update. The knowledge holders at the time were, for whatever reason, reluctant to provide their experiences and their information, their research. So what I needed to do was create an international group, which is the Centre for Static Electricity and Lightning Protection, or CSELP. And that particular group is made up or comprised of a number of research scientists, development individuals, manufacturers, regulators, so quite a diverse representation. And the whole idea was to try and fill in some of those gaps. So at the time, what were the concerns? Up until that point, unfortunately, the industry had taken the position that static electricity was not an electrocution type event. It was not something where somebody potentially could have a fatality from direct contact with static electricity. And so from the human interaction point, there appeared to be this, you know what, it's not really hurting anyone. It's not really creating problems for industry in the direct contact sense. So should we really have a standards committee, and should we really have a standard for that matter in terms of that aspect of static electricity? What we found overwhelmingly was that the reports across the world and Australia as well was that there were specific types of static, and we don't call them electrocution events, but basically static electricity in terms of a static shock. And that particular shock being of such value that it can cause injury, or in the sense that it can cause primary injury, secondary injury, or tertiary injury.
Yes.
And so what we established at that point was, well, we really have an issue here, because the current standard doesn't pick that up and doesn't provide guidance in relation to that. And we have events that are occurring in Australia where people are in fact being hurt by direct contact. And so that became part of the value of update. The second part is that we obviously were aware of a number of fires, explosions that created significant damage to property as well as injury and fatality across the world, but we weren't able to gather that information in a way, a meaningful way, that we could share with the committee or committees now, so that they could understand what the actual hazard is and what the risks are, and then what the actual incidents are specifically. And so the CSELP itself was responsible, and still is, for gathering and collating the data across the world from all of its members in terms of incidents and what took place, why it took place, root cause analysis, injury type, damage type, all of those sorts of things. That's more about process. So you've got this human interaction point where you physically have people that can be hurt, and then you have this process situation where you can have obviously fires, explosions, and then all of the secondary issues that come from that, or the supplementary consequential issues that come from that. So gathering all of that information meant that we had this basis that we could then present to numerous groups, so that we could obviously explain to them why we need to have the standards committee reinstated. And then also, more importantly, understand what the landscape needs to be for the standards themselves, because ASNZS 1020 originally was a standard that looked at both hazardous areas and non-hazardous areas. It didn't distinguish between the two, and it made comment and guidance in relation to those, to both aspects of the site. What we realised was that the group itself realised that there were at that time standards in the world. So at that particular time, there was a TS standard 60079.32.1.
Yes.
That was very, very good in terms of hazardous areas and provided really, really good information. So that particular standard was something that we wanted to adopt. But what it didn't do was look at a lot of the aspects of the human interaction in non-hazardous areas and what the concerns were, picking up those particular concerns within the committee and actually being able to provide guidance, provide a standard. We needed to change the way in which we actually looked at 1020. And so we have now got a situation, we've got a non-hazardous area standard and a hazardous area standard, and they're very important because we learnt very early on that when people talk about hazardous areas, there's this just natural assumption that they classify their site as a hazardous area site, without actually understanding that a hazardous area may in fact be a very small proportion of that particular site.
There's a reason for that though. And you've brought up a really good point, because the classification, when we're talking about Australia and New Zealand specifically, across different states and territories, there's a different definition for hazardous area. For example, WA has 3 definitions within its 3 different legislative bodies or administering bodies. It has one for technical engineering design, and that deals with an explosive atmosphere. It has another definition that relates to the storage and handling of a dangerous good. That becomes a hazardous area, and that's under their work health and safety legislation. And then there's another portion that deals with toxic acute gas. So you've got definitions, and when we talk about them in an industry context, it's really important for us to define which particular definition we're referring to, or otherwise you get an argument or a discussion starting where people are like, oh, that's not what it is, that's what it is. Like, no, we need to put that into context and put that into the framework of what we're actually putting to. So it's a really good point that you pulled up.
Yeah, and you can also add a number of other factors in terms of that. So whilst the states also look at a number of different ways in which to describe or even delineate hazardous areas, there's this discussion around the electrical equipment that is used within a specific hazardous area. And so you go to certain standards and they talk about or reference, you can only use certain types of equipment within a particular hazardous zone, right?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that clearly is an issue for static electricity is that static electricity, or lightning for that matter, as an ignition source, is a very challenging ignition source to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And so hazardous areas in terms of their pure classification in the electrical sense, so zone 0, 1, zone 2, 20, 21, 22, what that does is it gives some information. And that information is, in certain cases, you've got a hazardous atmosphere that exists for longer periods of time than others. But the interesting thing is that under the hazardous area classification, you have conditions, and those conditions are absolutely critical for static electricity. Because if you look at the human interaction piece, and then you also look at the process piece, if you've got a hazardous area, for instance, that is only present once a year for a period of 2 hours, then you can manage that particular risk in a particular way, or that hazard in a particular way. When you have the same sort of atmosphere that's available, but it's available every single day for long periods and duration, then your human interaction in that particular process becomes challenging to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things about the 2 standards is that we really needed to understand things like minimum ignition energies. We needed to understand the types of material that's being processed, because when you take into consideration an individual can actually walk a very short distance and produce a value of energy release that is sufficient to ignite the majority of the vapors and gases that we manufacture, and you overlay that with that person can actually walk from an area that is a non-hazardous area, so it's not a zone, right? So they can walk from an area that isn't classified into an area that's classified. And so both standards needed to be in play in order to pick up that risk. And one of the things that we noticed very early on around the world, and Australia leads the world in this, we're now actually being referenced in Europe and the United States, is because we clearly understand that even if you sit in a non-hazardous area, like an office, for argument's sake, and you walk from that office into a production facility, you are at that point generating or accumulating static to the point where, if all of the conditions are met, you could discharge into an atmosphere and create a fire or explosion. that particular risk or that profile was not picked up in other standards around the world. We're one of the first to do that, so we're quite proud of that.
So in that context, for example, the 60,079, the TC, I think, or TS. So that deals with the equipment portion of it. Am I correct in saying that? And
No,
then
yep, sorry.
and then your other standard that relates to the human interaction side of it, because generally speaking, the 60,079 series of standards is primarily electrical equipment within a hazardous area. That's what falls under the typical, your mandatory standard framework, your AS3000s,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, or it sits with the technical body of work. So is that the correlation? Is that the correlation that you were able to find? You were able to isolate the human element from the 60,079 portion?
I wish it was that simple. And I also, you've raised something that I'm hoping people will pay considerable attention to, or significant attention to. So 60079.32.1 is actually quite different to the remainder of the 60079 series, in that it doesn't concentrate on the electrical values. It actually literally looks at static electricity as an ignition source specific to liquids, gases, and powders. So it breaks up its standard into that particular format, and it talks about what the things are that you need to look at. And then it talks about things like suction truck application. So it actually breaks down certain processes and gives guidance, because those areas were considered to be of significant risk. So it's a little bit different to the rest of the suite. And in that sense, it stands alone. So but you're right, it concentrates on process. So when we look at the two, we're talking about, whilst 1020 is not about necessarily a range of processes, it talks more about electrostatic shock. It talks about the types of controls that can be used in a environment specific to static electricity and what those controls can do. But it also concentrates on two pieces of information that affect both non-hazardous areas and hazardous areas within an actual workplace. It overlaps in the sense that it's asking for the PCBU to physically conduct an assessment as a matter of minimum once per year. And in the event that the site answers a specific number of questions, because the standard provides guidance in terms of, here's some of the questions you should ask yourself in terms of this assessment. And things like, do you operate a forklift? Have you had previous incidents relating to static electricity? Has someone been hospitalised? Those sorts of questions, right?
Yeah.
Then it then moves you towards having what's called a static control plan, and this is one of the missing pieces that we've not had, and one of the interesting pieces that is now being recognised outside of Australia and New Zealand. So this static control plan is all about, what are your controls at site? This is because those controls have a bearing on your hazardous area, and some of those controls, so your main earth, for argument's sake, and how you actually have installed your main earth, and whether or not it can have a particular level of resistance. Your main earth is very rarely sitting inside your hazardous area.
You've got the provision within a hazardous area to also have your potential bomb for all your metallic items. So was that included in the plan as well?
Yeah, in both. So yeah, so what we've tried to capture here is that you've got a lot of instrumentation, you've got a lot of controls that sit outside of your zone, but that they impact your zone. So it's not just the human interaction point. You've also got bonding mechanisms, bonding systems. You've got earth systems, earth networks. So we recognised early on that they are primary controls. So in a lot of sites, the earth and the bond that is created for a particular application is what is commonly termed as the primary control. Now, if you have a look or go back through your electrical background, when you have a primary control, let's say an RCD or one of your fault loop impedance mechanisms, yeah, if one of those go, there's panic, right? There's panic because people understand that that is stopping something from happening. One of the things about static is we've said, oh, well, we've got an earth and we've got a bond, but we never ever actually tested them or looked at them closely.
Mm-hmm.
But as the primary control, if they don't have levels of resistance that are acceptable, sufficient as per the guidance, you can increase risk of that particular hazard or that particular issue. And so the standards in conjunction with each other are able to pick up all of those aspects, and using them together, you're able to cover more of the controls. So yes, I would have loved the idea if we had one international standard that dealt with all of those things that we could have adopted, but it's impossible.
The reason being is you've got a technical application. You've got a technical application for the standard, so that's what the 60,079 series of standards.
Yep.
And then you've got the administrative aspects of it, and that deals with work health and safety, about making sure that your risk is as low as reasonably practicable, your assessments and the like. And they're two different bodies of standards. They're two different government administrative teams that administer them. So the overlap that you have can be quite difficult contextually. And a lot of people don't understand that. And like, let's not shy away from the point that a lot of people who operate hazardous areas, their inspection schemes aren't up to date anyway. So as far as the documentation side, there's a lack of education because the driving points of it. So I can clearly see like the work that you're doing. It's a big workload. It would be a big undertaking.
Yeah, it has been, and we're now in the process of, obviously, as the chair of the committee, one of my responsibilities is to assist the regulators in terms of their own training, because when we did the analysis, there is a clear lack of training across the regulatory spectrum. And so if you look at the training that's currently being conducted now in terms of, say, WorkSafe Victoria, IAVIC, some of the investigation teams within the regulatory space, what we are doing is providing them information on the standard. You've made this point on numerous occasions. The regulatory authorities are restricted in the manner in which they can do certain things. Just because a standard exists, it doesn't mean that it's mandatory and everybody has to do everything that exists on that particular standard. But there are mechanisms within the regulatory space where things that are of consequence, that are of issue to the regulators, can be dealt with in a particular way, codes of practice and a whole list of other mechanisms, right? Now, without going into this, because it's quite complex, as you know, one of the things that has been recognised within the WorkSafe Vic team, which is important, there has been at this stage a number of fatalities that have occurred where the root cause has been designated as static electricity. Static electricity created a fire or explosion that resulted in fatalities, and that led the team, which I think is a wonderful outcome from a very, very sad situation, to obviously look internally and see where the gaps were. And so the gaps in this instance were, what do we understand about the standards, and how do we look at the two standards in terms of how to provide guidance, or not provide guidance from a regulatory sense, but how a site should be looking at their own static electricity hazards and issues. So, this training across the country is important because, it would be fair to say, and I don't think any of the regulators who would watch this particular podcast would get their nose out of joint.
Oh, they're probably going to be biasing it.
Well, that's a different discussion. But I don't think they get their nose out of joint because they're fully cognizant of the fact that static electricity, like the rest of industry, was something that was considered to be, oh, well, it's okay, it's just off to the side. And we should be all right if we kind of just bond and earth stuff. That hasn't been the case. And we've had fatalities, we've had fires, and we've had quite significant property damage across the country, to the point where we've had businesses literally burned to the ground and not being able to recover.
So the old standard that was rewritten, what was the previous stage of that particular standard? It seemed like I'm going off on a tangent. I'm on a different like tangent here, but I'm not. I want to be able to bring it back. When was that last review before you stepped in?
1995. So
that was still when we were under a descriptive-based system. Do this, do that, and it will work.
So the language of that particular document is probably not as strong as the language of the new document. So a lot more shoulds than shalls.
Yeah, it would have still provided like so the change from an old platform of an old platform of standards that we had, they were very much descriptive. They were do this, do that, and you'll meet the objective. A good example for all the slackers out there, the old standards where a cable floating could no more than 600 mil apart. So that's where the hammer lift rule came in. The new standard that came out in like 2000 when it changed from SAI to ASNZS standard, was a cable shouting to be adequately supported and prevent mechanical damage. So see the difference in terminology. So that's why if it's a standard sunset for that particular amount of time, I'll go on and back for regulators on this one. They've probably got enough on their plates dealing with all the large-scale problems, large-scale investigations, large-scale fires, explosions, fatalities, all that kind of stuff, and having to be able to refer back to a standard that probably doesn't have it's been sunset for such a portion of time that hasn't been called up in any mandatory standard in any capacity. That would be like, where do you start with that? And if
absolutely
yourself in the industry, they don't know what they're doing. Like, it's not they don't know what they're doing. It's a case that they just don't have the resources to use that.
I think that's more a fair point. We certainly have an under-resourced regulatory landscape.
Oh.
Apart from the fact that, this is the first time I've heard this for the audience, not for you, Travis. The first time I've heard Travis actually put himself in front of the regulatory team and provide some protection. I am interested in the commentary because we've had, in fairness, as you mentioned, this sort of sunset period, if you like, yeah. But we've also had fatalities that have occurred since the new standard has been in place.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to get to the next step.
Mm.
And so getting to the next step is about the thing that you mentioned in the very, very beginning of this particular podcast, and that's the training component. That's the awareness component. And we understood as a committee that we needed to start with the regulators, and we needed to help them to understand the changes in the actual standards themselves. how we as a committee were looking at the two standards working in conjunction, so that they got an idea of that and they could make whatever decisions they needed to make. But we certainly haven't left it there, because the next step for us is the insurance industry, which may seem for some of the people that are listening to the podcast a bit unusual, but what happens is we've got quite a number of insurers that place a high value on compliance to particular standards, Australian standards, as part of their insurance protocols and their ability to insure an entity. And so they need that update, because whenever there's a fire or whenever there's an issue, and a particular location is asking for an insurance to be paid out, you get insurance inspectors that physically go to those particular sites, and they've got to investigate what the issues were. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the insurance industry has asked for an update and training. It's not something that we've volunteered as a committee, or as a chair, but we're obviously doing the same thing. That's next step. Emergency response. So our responders across the country have begun asking for the training, because if you think about a situation where there's been a rollover on the Hume Highway between Melbourne and Sydney, if that rollover results in the lanes of the highway being closed on both sides, and we have a spillage of some kind, then there's a couple of things that have to happen. And one of those things is, if we send a vacuum truck to suction that particular value, if it's possible, we have to understand what that truck is going into as far as static goes. So, can it build up enough or accumulate enough static that at one point under suction it could potentially create its own hazard and risk. So, there are many facets to these two standards that apply to areas that aren't just industry. And so our, response teams are critical. And then we're also being asked to provide some updated training and also some evidence-based training for the Defence Force, because we have a number of applications. Whilst I can't talk about them here, I can say that we have a number of defence capabilities that are affected by static electricity, and so these two standards have a bearing on elements, even though there are military standards that our Defence Force actually uses. They've asked for this as an update to see if they've captured this additional information. It's a lot of work, and for those of you that have an interest in standards, I certainly wasn't somebody that wanted to get into the standards landscape. It's a lot of hard work. It's volunteer work. You're not paid. It can be challenging at times, but the reward is high. In this instance, we've been quite fortunate.
Sorry, yeah, that's the flow.
Well, I'll tell you something. Here's the two things that we need. All right, and I'm going to make this. This will probably be politically incorrect, but I'm going to make this as correct as I possibly can. We do not have enough diversity in our standards community. And when I say diversity, I mean from an age perspective, as well as from a male-female perspective. And we certainly need to address that, because for those of you looking at me, my beard is white. It used to be black. I'm not getting younger. We need to have some people coming back or coming through the standards community that are going to be able to take up the roles that some of us more senior people now have. And it is important for us to communicate that to those people who have some interest in this particular space.
So let's just talk about that for a minute, because you've I've spoken to some people about that, and it's really difficult for new blood to get into standard committees. And the reason for that is some companies already have access into a committee, so they already have good representation. They already have all of that, which is great. But the people who hold those positions within those committees is senior, and they don't want to give it up because they're there with their friends. They've been on that committee. It gives them some form of semblance of
Respectability.
And it's like, and what's happened from a landscape perspective as well, from an employment perspective, young people who have an understanding of technology, systems, all of that inspiration and innovation, if there's no career pathway for them, they're just going to move. They're going to jump ship. They're going to change jobs, or there's no security in the job, so they have to do that. And so, for a business decision, for a company to go, well, we're going to relinquish this person's position. That person who's been with the company is probably a technical director status. There's a high probability that they'll leave to put some new blood into it. So it's not I don't think it's a problem. I don't think the problem's as simple as trying to get diversity into it. I think it needs quite a decent shift in our approach to the problem at play. Yes, it is volunteer. Yes, if you work for a larger organisation, you will be responsible through that position, so they will pay for that, but there's a lot of time that goes on with it. A lot of time, especially sitting on an Australian technical committee is different to sitting on an international committee, because if you go international, there's a bigger play that you're putting there's a bigger hat that you're tossing your life, so a bigger ring that you're tossing your hat into, and you have to play at that level, and you have to be available to fly to X, Y, Z. And if you're a solo person or small business, they might not want to cough up that fast.
Okay, so let's unpack that. So the first thing is diversity. I've given you the end requirement without the pathway. So whilst the end requirement is still absolute, the pathway is really what we need to sort of assist Standards Australia with. Now, here's a couple of things that have been raised. There has been a suggestion that the monies that go towards the purchase of standards, that a portion of that particular monies is made available for the sponsorship of people on committees.
That occurs in larger committee members anyway, as standard. I'll stand a bit for everyone on that one, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I can only tell you that I'm certainly not compensated as a chair of a committee, and arrangements made with other individuals if they are, which I'm not sure about, are those. But that's one of the suggestions. Another suggestion, these are just suggestions, because this particular pathway has been not only been made aware to Standards Australia, but Standards Australia has asked for some feedback in relation to this. They're certainly not putting their heads in the sand and saying we've got a perfect system. So some of the other ones that I can remember off the top of my head is involvement at the university level. Period of time that students can become available and work with the Standards Committee as part of their own programs.
Move to debating saying, debating standards, right? No.
Yeah.
Where's the sign?
Yeah, so it's the challenge is the pathway. Not only are you correct, but the problem we have is that the models that exist overseas aren't necessarily going to work for our country. So we've got to come up with a unique way for Australia and New Zealand to get to the end goal, which is diversity, right? Or shrinking numbers, because we certainly do not want to see a decrease in the amount of members. The other option, or the other discussion, was in the nominating organisation space. So we have a number of nominating organisations, and it's about how they may be able to sponsor their particular members who go to these particular committees. So they're the three that sort of were top of mind when you sort of raised it. I'm sure there's more, and there'll be other people that can provide additional information or correct us if we've got this this wrong. But I know that those three have been suggested. My concern is probably the same for many. The amount of work that I do is at the expense of my company. So the work that I do is unbiased work. So just for those people who are on this or listening to this podcast, if the centre is if someone contacts the centre and asks a question specific to the standard, we only answer that question specific to the standard. We don't talk about brands, equipment. We don't talk about any of those things. We don't lead them down a path in relation to control outcomes. We talk about what do you need to know in relation to the clause. So as the chair or the committee, what do you physically need to know? Do you understand what that statement is? Do you understand how that your responsibilities in relation to that particular statement? That's the extent of the work that we do. When we do training, it's exactly the same. When we provide information and updates, it's exactly the same. So there's no monetization, right? And maybe there's people out there that say, well, you should. Well, it's not how the standards...
You can't. There's conflict of interest if you're
Absolutely.
Receiving money from that was conflict of interest.
Absolutely. So what happens is you have to be quite firm in saying to people, when you join a standards committee, you are doing that for the pure purpose of trying to get the best outcome for the workplace in terms of information, understanding, controls, blah, blah, blah. So the challenge for us is that you've got people on committees that have been there 20 odd years who are either funded through their organisation or have the self-wealth to be able to do the things that they can do for the committee. In my case, it's certainly not finite. It's not a situation where I can do this for the next 30 years because it comes at a cost. And the hours that are put in are significant. But the reward for me specifically is that in 2013, I began audit and investigation processes into significant fire and explosions where injuries were such that we have people not being able to return to work. At that point, I looked at my wife and I said, we cannot continue to have this situation. We have to address the missing information, the gap. And we've got from that particular point to 2023, so a significant period of time. We've got to a point where we've started what I would consider to be a part of the journey. Certainly not what I would consider to be the culmination. So I still have some work to do. And the committee is a wonderful experience in the sense that there's give and take. There's opportunity to hear varying views. When we restrict the diversity, we lose some of those views. I certainly don't want to have the situation where you mentioned before of people getting on committees, becoming friends, that becoming more of a social thing. I really like the cut and thrust of our committee in particular, who is run by a lovely lady, Nia Valenti. One of the things that Nia was able to do was create an atmosphere where you can have a real like red hot go and say your piece respectfully, right? But make sure you provide evidence. And so the committee continually challenged each other and had to compromise and come back and challenge each other and had to compromise. And so whilst, people look at a standard and they go, oh yeah, well, that's what we should do. The committee's actually looking at it and going, how can we make that better? And I can tell you right now, I mean, we're in the background, we're already working on 1020 because there's advances to testing protocols, advances to controls, changes in the way in which we look at those things. They will need to be addressed in the next 3, 4, 5 years. I certainly want to be around for that next stage, and that's as far as I can look forward. But as I mentioned to you before, without trying to make the committee something of disinterest to somebody, the rewards for me are that I can see change. Every day when I walk out into an environment and talk to a PCBU, I am physically seeing that change. And so that is like one of the greatest rewards I can have in my, specifically within my industry and what we do. And I certainly hope other people can feel that because it's not a, you know this better than anyone. It's not like people walk up to you and go, hey, thank you for your service. 9 times out of 10, it's, here's a size 10 shoe. I'd really like to put it somewhere.
Compliance, because I don't see the work, I don't see the background work that goes into it all. They just see the pain points that people are imposing on them, and they're just trying to do the right thing. Right? Everyone's trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Like you want to make another law. Here it is here.
Yeah, and it's we're lucky in the sense that we can, you look at every clause within that particular standard 1020, and there is evidence to support each clause. I mean, we primarily looked at that document and said, what is the evidence for that statement? So when we talk about, 10 ohms resistance or less for a specific type of, bond or earth or whatever, that's because we found this case resulting in the following thing. And so therefore, we don't want this to happen again.
So you already like your threshold limitation.
Yeah, and I think for our committee that was important because probably other committees it's easier because you're not waiting 20 odd years for the update. Usually got a 5-10 year kind of, and they're working on that update. Yeah, but for this particular standard, you've got such a long sunset and nothing being done, and so we really had to pare it back. And we really had to ask ourselves the questions. And some of the committee members, absolutely awesome. They're happy to challenge. The question that came up all the time, and it's something I use within audit and investigation processes that I undertake, is this concept of show me. And you'll hear in the committee on occasion, well, show me, show me where that exists. Show me why that is the case. Show me why we should do the following things. No, we were very, very fortunate in that sense. There are the committees that work in different ways, and you certainly you certainly get different feels from those particular committee. But I can tell you with 1020 that under Nia Valenti's stewardship, I'm very proud of being able to walk out into the industry, out into the community, and physically see people trying to work through this stuff and being able to provide guidance to them.
I think it's the case when you do this kind of work, specifically within standard and standard committees or within the regulatory space. The reason that I entered the regulatory space was different. I entered it because I work under a preface of you have to earn the right to complain. So you have to do everything within your power to change it. And if you don't, well, then you can complain. So that's why I entered it. But it's a claiming thing. Like, you're not doing it from a monetary perspective. You're doing it to try and the, push the message forward. And it takes a certain individual to do that. There are some bad actors within the regulatory space. So I'm not going to shy away from that. But 9 times out of 10, they're good people who have technical ability, who understand the nuance, who want to move things forward for the benefit of the regulated community. And my hat goes off to them. I couldn't do it anymore. And I'm only a young pup. So that's what's at my head off to guys like you who sit on those committees and have your own little circle of influence that are just trying to, because it's not one person that has it, it's kind of a collective unison of people that create the best outcome for people. So yeah, take my hat off to you. Now, we're coming up to the IDC conference in August, so you're a speaker there. That's why we're connecting with this. But you want to talk to people about, you've got two things. You've got like a workshop that you're dealing with, and you've also got your speaking event. So what can people hope to hear from Ken that you'll be presenting, and then what's the workshop about as well?
So we'll start with the component.
What is that?
I think you're going to be the MC, aren't you?
Yeah.
Let's hope that you start me off better than that.
Here's Ken. He's going to talk about starting. Sit down.
Yeah, look, that particular component, I always challenging because I think we've got 45 odd minutes, right? And but what I'm going to do there is I'm going to show a video for those people who haven't seen an investigation. I'm going to take them through the process of what went wrong and why. A little bit of root cause analysis, but I'm going to literally just talk about what the updates are to standards, and in particular 1020 and 6079.32.1, and what it means to them. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple because the idea is to say, here's what can happen, here's what it looks like, here's the reason why we have to have the things that we have to have, these are the things that we have to have, and how do we go about trying to do those things. Here's a few examples. That's probably as much as I'm going to talk about in the presentation. Look, the workshop's a little bit different because the workshop, what we're trying to do there, we have a 4-hour window. So we're physically going to take the attendees through how to conduct a static electricity assessment, and then how to put together a static control plan.
Now, is that going to be different for, like, obviously because the IDC conference is kind of geared towards hydrogen, but you also going to touch, because correct me if I'm wrong, I will see that a lot of your work would relate more to dust than gas, or am I wrong?
Probably more towards gas than dust and powders. And not that dust and powders aren't an issue. My work specifically, because we're quite a reactive business, the consultation business that I own. We are the investigation process, the audit process, and usually it's within the vapors, gases, liquids kind of environment that we have the explosions. Although, if you start to look at the last 2 years, we're certainly starting to look at flours, sugars, a number of the metal dusts. So there are others, and we do work in that space, but probably more so in the former. Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't isolate hydrogen in terms of because we wouldn't say hydrogen needs to be dealt with differently in terms of an SEA or an SCP. The premise of looking at anything is the same.
Yeah.
However, there are a number of additional things that have to be done in relation to hydrogen that you would not necessarily have to do in relation to some of the other liquids and gases. And there are a number of other standards that apply to hydrogen specifically that you would also have to take into consideration. There are, at this stage, and again, happy to be corrected, at this stage, there are no standards that have a higher requirement than that of 1020 and 60079.32.1. So we don't have a hydrogen standard that is saying that you have to have a resistance value for your equipotential bond, for instance, at one ohm, right? But there are standards within the hydrogen space that call upon more rigorous controls in terms of all manner of things: flooring, footwear, clothing, the manner in which we use materials in and around the space, all of that sort of stuff. So, that 4 hours is going to be, whilst people look at it and go, oh, God, 4 hours, it's literally going to be quick, because the SEA, or the static assessment, whilst it's a simple thing to do, you do have to think about your business in a particular way. The SCP is then, so you take an SCA and you start thinking very, very wide, and the SCPs, you start bringing it back to narrow controls, right? So it's that process of doing this continually through that program. And so on that workshop, we're going to be taking the attendees through a challenging static control plan, and then allowing them to ask questions, because one of the things that we find within workshops is you get to a point where you're 3 hours in, you still got an hour to go, and people are going, yeah, but I kind of, our place doesn't work that way, or we can't do that this way, or we can't do these things that way, or so.
What we find at workshops is people are looking for the magic pill. They're looking for the answer that applies to their specific problem, concern, scenario, situation. That's not. You're providing genuine information to the public. Like, then they have to either ask a consultant or go do some research and apply it for their specific needs. You can't.
No, I mean, you certainly can't cover. I mean, I can give you an example. So the dangerous goods space, you have storage, and then you have some locations that have storage and mixing or dispensing, right? Now, the storage space, people sometimes are confused about what the requirements are, because, it's finished goods. And so therefore, what are we worrying about? The issue that we have is that the spillage of any of those finished goods in that particular space, that's the risk. So when you take it off a truck out of a container, you drive across a floor space, you load it up into racking, what are your controls in relation to the worst case scenario of a spillage?
No, I should be that way. Just get them up.
Well, and so, the static control plan goes into what do you do? Because if it's a she'll be right, mate, that's usually, that usually results in me having to go to site and try and work out why something exploded. Yeah. So, so yeah, there'll be questions that even within the exact same family, if you like, of industry, or even the same site, there'd be individuals that go, do we really need to look at that? You do. I will allow a little bit of time for those sorts of questions if required, but you are spot on. At the end of the day, we provide the information. They need to go out and talk to their SME or their consultants, or if they need some guidance. I'm happy to provide guidance on the day outside of the workshop or the presentation at the conference. That's essentially the manner in which we're going to interact with the attendees at the conference and the workshop, and we certainly hope that for those people that are looking or are looking at this particular podcast and saying to themselves, have we actually conducted an SEA? Do we have an SCP?
Mm.
The first thing you're going to want to do is, one, go to the conference, because at least we can tell you what an SEA and SCP is and why.
Mm.
But if you're at a point where you're like, we also need to understand how to do it, go to the workshop. One of the things about IDC this year in this specific workshop is the comments that came back from last year were that they wanted more time to understand their responsibilities in terms of SEAs and SCPs. So they certainly wanted to understand how to do things, because there were challenges for them in their own space. So what IDC has done is they've said, okay, well, we understand that normally if we engage someone like myself to conduct training in Perth, there is a substantial cost for our organisation to provide training to, say, a group of 10 people, for argument's sake.
Yes.
So IDC has primarily sponsored the majority of this particular cost by trying to keep this specific workshop at a very, very low value, right? Comparatively speaking, we're talking 5, 6, 7 times what the value is of this particular workshop is what the normal cost would be. So for those that are or have project teams, engineering teams, safety teams, that have compliance teams, this is the workshop that you need to go to. This is where we would be physically talking to you about what your requirements are.
Linda doesn't she?
No, they don't. And I'm glad you mentioned this. I'm glad you mentioned this. This has been a bugbear of mine for 15 years. We don't train our electricians in static electricity. There's no module. We don't train our engineers in static electricity.
One other participation certificate or a ribbon. Come on, yeah.
So I'm more than happy. We can talk to Vinca. I'm more than happy to produce X amount of ribbons and bring them over. I don't know the value of them. Happy to do it, but yeah, no, we don't do it as a registered training program. We just do it as an informative program. But
Sure.
I hope in the future, I certainly do. I hope the industry develops enough to have RTOs that would then specialise in this types of training. But at this stage, that just doesn't exist.
All right, we're going to wrap this up, Ken. So, final plug, where can people find you? And if they want to know more, like, how do they get in contact with you?
Look, if you want to talk to the chair of the committee, and I want to make this distinction quite clear, they can go to a website which is CSELP, CSELP.com, and follow the prompts, and essentially you'll get to myself. That is a service where we offer, based on the committee's experience, in relation to the standard. It's not a place for you to go, hey, listen, I need a static control bar or a earthing system or that's not that. But if you do want to talk about investigations, audits, what types of controls are required at your site, the implementation of a static control plan, then you can contact me at Static Electricity Control. So that's staticelectricity.com.au. Or you can follow the prompts there. My details, contact details are on that particular website, and we can then obviously then talk to you about, your requirements at that particular point.
Excellent. We'll provide all those links so people can get in contact with you if they're viewing this or if they're watching this on whatever form or medium they have. So, Ken, thanks again for taking the time out of your day to talk to us about your background, about your work that you do in the community, and also what you're going to bring in the IDC conference. Really appreciate it. So thank you again.
My pleasure, mate. Great catching up with you again.
No worries.
See you, bud.